Adelie Manelli. I'm a legal fellow at the Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law at New York University School of Law. On behalf of the Guarini Center, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today to take part in this very important conversation about the land use and planning process in New York City and some recent proposals for its reform. As many of you may be aware, New York City's land use and planning policies significantly impact the city's growth, development, economy, and environment in ways that really fundamentally affect the everyday lives of its residents. And yet this process has been met with some criticism over the years for being inefficient and costly, for lacking accountability and transparency, and for leading to inequitable outcomes for many communities. In response to these increasing calls for reforms, city officials have recently introduced some proposals which would fundamentally alter the city's land use and planning process. And in this event, we're looking at 3 of these. So first, we're going to be exploring the City Council's recent proposal for comprehensive planning. Then we're going to turn to reforms to the city's environmental review process. And finally, we'll discuss a proposal to study racial impacts in the land use process. But before I dive in, I want to introduce our panelists, and in no particular order. These are Elena Conte. She's a senior fellow at the Pratt Center for Community Development. Bruno Daniel Garcia, a coalition strategist at Communities Resist. Noah Kazis, a legal fellow at the New York University Furman Center. Eric Kober, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Marcel Negret, a senior planner at the Regional Plan Association. And Spencer Williams, Director of Advocacy at the Municipal Art Society. So I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here and to hear your thoughts on these issues. And to our audience, we also want to invite you to ask any questions you may have through the Q&A function. And we're hoping to address some of those questions at the end. So with that, I'm hoping we can just dive right in and talk a bit about comprehensive planning. So New York City is one of the only major cities in the US which does not have a comprehensive plan. And community advocates and some experts have been pushing the cities for the years to adopt one. Not everyone necessarily agrees, though, that a comprehensive plan is necessary. And there have also been some uncertainties about how effective it would really be at curing some of the problems we are seeing with the city's current land use and planning process. There are also some questions about whether adopting a plan would even be politically feasible. An earlier effort to adopt comprehensive planning during the city charter revision process in 2019 was abandoned. Late last year, Speaker Corey Johnson introduced legislation which would create a 10-year comprehensive planning cycle for which officials from the Department of City Planning and other city agencies have testified against, among other agencies. And so, because some of our audience might be unfamiliar with this concept, Elena, I was hoping you could perhaps walk us through what comprehensive planning is, what it might look like, how it differs from New York City's current process, and what the process of implementing it might look like.
Yeah, I figured it might be good to unmute myself for that. First, thanks so much, Adeline, and to all the panelists and everybody who is listening in right now. Planning, and I hope it's not just land use planning, but really planning is having its moment. This is our time. So I'm going to attempt to touch on some of that. The rest we'll get into in deep conversation. But, channeling my best Sophia Petrillo, I want to say, picture it. It's January 2022 and a new mayor enters office, right? And this mayor is to consider the mandate of the electorate, right? The ongoing devastating impacts of COVID-19, because we will not be done with it. The mounting challenges presented by climate change, and the staggering racial and socioeconomic disparities that are owed reparation through clear-eyed affirmative policies and programs, lest they go unaddressed and needlessly continue to threaten more lives and the livelihood of the city. So that's the moment. In February, the Office of Long-Term Planning, right, could begin to work on the creation of the first Conditions of the City report, examining over the next year issues that are not looked at comprehensively anywhere today. Issues like residential displacement risk, access to opportunity, and current and projected infrastructure gaps, looking at all of these through an equity lens. Then, guided by a long-term planning steering committee comprised of representatives from historically excluded groups, right? Nothing like that exists right now. Citywide equity goals that can be measured and district level targets will be set for things like housing, jobs, open space, resiliency infrastructure, schools, the whole lot, right? And these goals, the citywide and the district level targets that follow them, will be completed 18 months into the new administration. At the same time, community districts, and again, here's a new piece, actually equipped with data and resources, undergo genuine planning efforts to identify priorities and craft land use scenarios. The questions that they are grappling with marry the social and the physical, right? As they often do right now. But in this future reality, there is actual opportunity for the social questions to get addressed and not just tossed aside in favor of the hot button land use centered planning process that exists today. Following those milestones, a draft long-term plan is created and is released 2 years into the administration's term, right? All of those pieces are inputs into this draft. And over the year after that, right, it is supplemented by a 10-year capital strategy that looks at the money in a detailed way, right? What's needed? What are the sources identified? That's a 10-year capital strategy that aligns. And then over another year, right, the pieces are considered through, and we don't have anything like this today, right? A robust, well-crafted, funded, inclusive participation process involving the public at large, community boards, borough presidents, and the city council, leading to a final long-term plan, right, to guide the future for 10 years. That is followed by a general environmental impact statement, and the carrying out, all right, of this well-considered, integrated, comprehensive plan. I'm trying to be, it's no secret, right, that Pratt Center has long time been an advocate of comprehensive planning, right? I'm describing some of the pieces that are in the proposal that's currently before the city council and the mayor. There's lots of detail that could be discussed, and I wanted to highlight what I think some of the differences are, but I'm not entirely dispassionate. For me, some of the key pieces about what's really different in something like this, you heard me try to highlight. One is citywide data in an integrated look, right? Instead of the myriad of plans that people can't cross-check or understand or even speak to each other in ways that are accountable, the citywide conditions report and then the goals do that. The equity goals, right, is intentionally a disruption of the status quo, right? That currently grossly advantages wider, wealthier communities to the active detriment of the rest, which are the overwhelming majority, right? Right now, if a community is powerful enough to keep something from being suggested, it's never considered, right? And this basically makes the invisible more visible so that we can talk about what we need as a city. Resources with genuine opportunity to do neighborhood level planning, which are absent today, right? And a requirement that every neighborhood, right, consider the role it plays in achieving equity citywide. Environmental review in this type of a scenario is both more comprehensive, but also less, because of all these other pieces, you know, the only conversation for considering the impacts of actions, right? And finally, resources, this is in the capital strategy, are planned for and tied to analysis, looking at historical gaps, and tied to impacts, and not just divvied out in exchange for acquiescence with a political agenda. So gross oversimplification, but hopefully that is a little bit of information that can be a jumping off point for the conversation that we're gonna have. So thanks.
Thank you, Elena. And building on your remarks, I want to open this up to the other panelists. So does New York City actually need comprehensive planning? Why is it so important, and why are we seeing such growing attention to this issue right now? And what kind of problems would a comprehensive plan actually help to address? Perhaps Noah, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me and for hosting this conversation. It's a great group of people. I'm really excited about it. So in answering that question, I actually want to distinguish two things that we might be talking about. One is citywide planning and one is comprehensive planning. What I'm going to talk about is actually really citywide planning. I'm more of a skeptic of sort of the comprehensive piece of it, that we can really get all of this done in one go with your schools and your transportation and your sanitation and your land use. It's just really hard. Maybe I'm just a pessimist about bureaucracies. But the citywide piece of it, that we're looking at this all at once, I think that's coming up because if you look at sort of the central things we're trying to get our land use system to do and to fix right now, they are citywide dynamics, not local dynamics. It's not a moment where sort of the block by block is what zoning needs to most address. It's citywide and regional issues. So affordability, the way our housing markets work and the way prices are going up is not something you can address neighborhood by neighborhood. The chains of gentrification that start in the Village to Brooklyn Heights to Park Slope to Prospect Heights to Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy and on, that's a citywide dynamic, right? What Elena said about making the invisible visible, I think that's a great way of putting it. Likewise, climate change, I think, is the other big thing that we really need our land use system to do. And again, I don't care that much about an individual building's emissions. I care about making it so that lots of people can live in Manhattan and in transit-oriented parts of the rest of the city so that we can reduce our carbon emissions. It's like the single best thing anyone can do for their carbon footprint is move to New York City. But that's not something that a neighborhood-based planning process is especially well equipped to handle. So I think that there's a lot of value in having an institutional process that matches, that is citywide to match these citywide interests. And I like parts of the council proposal very much for doing that. Like the idea of sort of growth targets that then neighborhoods are asked how to implement it, right? Which is what neighborhoods are really good at. But not ask, how much growth does the city need? Because that's not a neighborhood question. That's a citywide question for us to answer together. So I think that's what the citywide planning is why it matches the moment so well. The individual details of the council's plan, there's a lot to work out. Devil's in the details, and I've got some big question marks. We can go into that or not. But the idea of having citywide process to match citywide problems, I think that's real.
Thank you so much, Noah. And so I guess one question I would have then is, some would argue that New York City already has a very robust land use and planning process. So I'm curious to the panelists' thoughts on what are some of the arguments against comprehensive planning? Why has New York City traditionally avoided adopting one? And wouldn't this added requirement simply make an already very complicated land use process just that much more complicated? And I'm hoping to bring Eric into this conversation.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I've always argued I was a New York City planner for 38 years that New York City does in fact have a comprehensive plan. It is the combination of the subway system and the way the zoning is sort of wrapped around it so that density follows transit. And that really is a comprehensive plan and a comprehensive planning framework, which the city has always followed since the beginning of zoning in the early 1900s. So there are many criticisms of the way land use planning is done in the city, and there is certainly a case for comprehensiveness, which is to say that it would be extremely helpful in the next administration to have a comprehensive framework that that guides what ultimately is initiated in terms of land use changes. There are some caveats that have to guide that. First of all, one very important caveat is the availability of resources, which is always quite limited. And that's going to affect how comprehensive the framework is and how detailed it is. The second issue is the availability of resources to implement any plan, which is also always limited. So we might agree, for example, that there are certain neighborhoods in the city that don't have enough public open space, and we might agree that it would be a good thing to acquire land and create more public parks in those neighborhoods. But that kind of agreement is always going to be constrained by the availability of money to do that. And then the third issue in terms of comprehensive planning, which I think is very important, is that things change. And that the idea that you could perhaps do a plan that is good for an entire decade is belied by the way in which the city is continually subject to very dramatic shocks that perhaps don't change everything, but change many things. COVID obviously is one of those shocks. Before that, we had Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which really alerted us to the city's vulnerability to climate change. Before that, we had 9/11. And so maybe once every decade, maybe twice every decade, the city is subjected to very dramatic shocks, and planning has to be nimble enough to adjust to that.
Thank you so much, Eric. You brought up an important point about resources, and I just want to touch on that. So, in light of COVID-19, its impacts, and the fiscal ramifications of the economic crisis, my question is this really the right time to be thinking about comprehensive planning, considering the resources that are required, right, to carry out this effort? Could trying to implement a policy like this right now actually hurt more than it helps? So for example, the Department of City Planning estimates that the requirement for preparing the environmental impact statements for each community district plan would cost about $500 million. And this is a time when the city is experiencing a huge budget crisis. So I want to open this up to the panelists, but Marcel, I'm curious about your thoughts on this matter.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here and talking about this these important issues. I agree with Eric in the need of having something that is nimble enough to respond to some of these external shocks. But I would argue that in this moment, it's super important that we're thinking about how to align these type of decisions. One of the most important aspirations of comprehensive planning is that it would hopefully align land use decisions with budget decisions related to infrastructure, operations and services, which is just a smart way, a short way to describe smart growth. And so in a time of fiscal uncertainty and economic crisis, not to mention climate change and other existential threats, I would argue that it's even more important to encourage these type of synergies and alignments. Planning ahead of time and achieving these type of efficiencies will result likely in procurement savings and more value for the money that we pay for these type of investments. So I think over time, this effort will pay for the costs incurred in planning ahead of time, probably many times over, including a GIS, which with that estimation, I strongly disagree that it would cost something in that figure, because it's completely ignoring deficiencies of doing citywide analysis and some of the more modern tools that we have access to today to do that type of analysis. So I think that the time is ripe, and this is the moment to start to think about in this more holistic citywide capacity.
Great, thank you so much, Marcel. I want to go back to some earlier comments that were made about the community's perception, and thinking about how communities are actually feeling about the growth and change that they've been experiencing over the last decade. So some communities really feel like there's a target on their neighborhoods, so what can comprehensive planning really offer to change up this dynamic? And Bruno, I was hoping to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for having me here. Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and there's a lot to say on this. I hope I'll have an opportunity later on as well. But I think Eric's comments really play on into what I was going to say, because I think exactly right. It's not like comprehensive planning isn't already happening in a way, which is unfortunately to say. It's not like we don't have a lot of robust bureaucracy, a lot of planning going on into the future right now and in the past, which is ultimately really unfortunate to say that it's going on without a lot of community input, which I know it's getting to be a really tired phrase, but it's building to the point that the comprehensive planning proposal, even the one that's currently on the floor, which, as many people say, it needs a lot of work. But the idea from communities to have comprehensive planning is really a push to democratize the thing. And that can only make things better. I think to the question specifically about how communities feel that their targets on the back, I think very much so. I think even Eric's comments kind of point to it, in that the plan right now is to add density via the subway map. People have strong feelings about the MTA, and there's not a lot of ways to push on how things get done, even in the MTA or even in the other many citywide processes that go to that. So it does feel like decisions are being made for community members without any sort of input. And that runs just completely against the grain of anything the city stands for. So I think, communities do feel like they have a target on the back. They very much actually do so. So comprehensive planning, at its very most essential, can just add democracy to the way we do these things and give people an opportunity to bring to light the core issues that have been, hidden for so long about how things happen, in particular, racial prejudice, racial bias, the invisibilization of race sometimes in this conversation. So yeah, I'll leave it all for there for now, but I think that's kind of the starting point.
Thank you, Bruno. And I think there's a real question, how can we expect communities to reach consensus on comprehensive planning when it so often feels like that stakeholders can't even reach consensus on what's happening in their own neighborhoods? How can we reach consensus on what is right for the cities? And I was hoping to get some feedback on this from Spencer.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Excited to be here. I think when we talk about consensus building, we have to talk about power and who has power in that process. And so, as was touched on earlier, there are certain communities that have the power, the default power to say no, and sort of who gets to be a disruptor is a really important question. And also, how do we then prioritize what we start with? And so there are deficiencies in a whole bunch of services, from bus lanes to bike lanes to schools to affordable housing. How we prioritize, how we invest in those in relationship to what community priorities are really fundamental to this conversation as well. And so by integrating that budget prioritization with a conversation that is broader than land use, to talk about how our schools function, how we have access to healthcare, and giving communities the power to do that. I think we've seen a lot of engagement and interest in our community-based and participatory budgeting that is sort of a start to that. The question is sort of, if we had a more expansive process to do that, how do we sort of be in community to really look at a shared picture of the city? I think data is really critical in helping bridge that gap and make those connections. Because when you put out something like a citywide displacement map or citywide vulnerability map, what that can do is really put into context for different neighborhoods the relative risk and the relative access to opportunity that exists in the city. And so that isn't saying that a community that may want a new park and want a new school shouldn't get those. It underscores and highlights that there are so many communities throughout the city who are not starting at that same level. And so being able to sort of see a shared picture is a really critical part in that. And I think that we have an opportunity as we come out of this crisis to really look at a city that is more united in realizing that when one of our neighbors is not healthy, that puts us at risk as well. And that we are only as strong as a city as we are providing opportunity neighborhood to neighborhood in terms of transit options, housing options, quality schools, access to open space. And so fundamentally, it's about sharing the burdens, the benefits, and the opportunities that growing and changing have to both bring new opportunities and new housing and new jobs, but also to really preserve the things that are critical to community character, whether that's buildings, churches, cultural aspects of their communities that they want to hold on to as we change. And I think that dance, that balance is really hard, but data and real community engagement goes a long way to sort of make sure that everyone's looking at the same picture.
Great, thank you so much. I want to be mindful of time and to make sure that we have enough time to go through all of our topics. And I feel like a lot of these themes are going to come up again as we continue our conversation. So I'm going to switch gears to seeker reform. And so seeker reform. So most discretionary land use actions by the city are subject to the city environmental quality review process. It's an environmental review process. So it's no surprise then, in the absence of comprehensive planning, right, that seeker has really evolved over the years to become more than just a standard environmental review procedure, and has instead become a really integral part of the land use process in New York. So seeker was designed to help agencies and policymakers understand and mitigate the potentially harmful impacts of their actions, and to also bring the public into that conversation before important decisions affecting their neighborhoods are actually made. And yet advocates and many other experts have argued that seeker has become so burdensome, so costly, that it actually impedes beneficial development and important policymaking. And so recently, the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination, they released an update to the seeker technical manual, perhaps the most important piece of guidance for city agencies. And another update is expected later this year. So maybe we should begin this conversation by talking a little bit about, so what is the relationship between, or what would be the relationship, right, between comprehensive planning and environmental review? And Noah, I was hoping to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, what it would be is, I think, not something we know. That's something that we would get to decide as part of creating a comprehensive planning process, because these are all statutes subject to, public control. I think the better question is, what should the relationship be between comprehensive planning and environmental review? And I think they stand in real deep tension as ways of thinking about planning, because the idea of comprehensive planning, as we've talked about, is to try and make these decisions earlier and more holistically. And what environmental review does is it does the exact opposite, not because of the planning parts that you were talking about, but because of the litigation parts. That is how environmental review is enforced. So what environmental review really comes down to is that a decision power is shifted to the very local level, to objectors, because anyone can bring that lawsuit. And it comes at the very end of the process, and then you get years of litigation potentially that halt everything. I'm definitely someone who thinks it's on the burdensome side, cards on the table. But so if we think that there is value in shifting power up to the city level and sort of early in the process, I think that necessarily requires us to try and reduce the teeth in environmental review, at least for certain kinds of projects or certain kinds of impacts, because it does not work to say we're going to put more process early, more process citywide, and also more process and obstacles at the end and at the hyperlocal level. That's just sort of an incoherent framework, I think. So as we talk about comprehensive planning, whether it's the council proposal or anything else, I think what we should do is take that spirit, whether it's part of this proposal or externally might be the better way to do it, and say, let's set priorities as a city, as a state, as a region, whether that's transit-oriented development or affordable housing development or any of the other things that we want as a city, and try and take those out of the seeker process as much as possible while still getting the good parts of sort of that you need, but minimize, so that we're making those decisions collectively, not individual objectors at the end. And that's, I think California's been experimenting with that, not super successfully yet, but I think that's the direction we have to go.
Thank you, Noah. That's very helpful. And so I guess, a sort of related question then is, how can seeker be coordinated with comprehensive planning to achieve a more efficient, more sustainable, more equitable planning process? Marcel, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's currently some tension on how the two are being conceived, mainly from more a technical perspective. My take is that seeker is largely based on parameters and thresholds that are largely arbitrary. So when it defines what is appropriate amount of open space for passive or active recreation, or what are the congestion levels from passing from a level of service of D to an F or whatever it is, I think what's lacking there, it's a fair share criteria or principles that are embedded in the comprehensive planning ideas or the indexes that they would be calling for that Spencer went over, and trying to align those methodologies together would facilitate that. And so instead of creating these arbitrary thresholds, we are creating metrics that are comparative in nature, that are comparing the conditions of one neighborhood or one locale, one specific geography to another, and how it relates to the city as a whole, so that when you're looking at those metrics, you're understanding, okay, maybe we have an adverse impact in terms of open space in, let's say, the Upper West Side, but what does that mean when you look at the open space conditions in East Flatbush, which compared to the city as a whole has the least amount of open space per capita? And so is it really an adverse impact compared to those citywide conditions? And so the more the methodologies of seeker that move into that kind of and embrace these ideas of fair share principles, I think the better we'll be in aligning these two procedures.
Thank you so much, Marcel. So I guess shifting the conversation away from comprehensive planning a little bit, and just focusing really on like seeker reform, right? So in your opinion, were the most recent updates to the seeker technical manual enough to address the problems and concerns that have been raised by critics? And perhaps what would you like to see in the next round of updates? And I suppose a related question then is, are we just too entrenched in seeker for any meaningful reform to actually take place? Like maybe do we need just less seeker? So Eric, I was hoping to get your thoughts on this.
Amending the secret technical manual, which is a guidance document on how to implement the mandates of the environmental conservation law, it's really tinkering on the margins, and the manual can't really change the process fundamentally because it's restricted by the legal framework. So, the real question to me is whether the state legislature ought to be considering changes to the environmental conservation law, which make it easier to do certain things that the public generally believes to be desirable. For example, building housing in transit-rich cities like New York City. So right now, statewide, the threshold for environmental review for a residential development is 4 units. 1, 2, and 3 family homes are exempted. 4 units, you're kicked into environmental review. That probably isn't an appropriate standard in New York City. In a recent report I wrote, I flagged an environmental short form, which is called an environmental assessment statement, that was prepared for a zoning proposal for an 82-unit apartment building in Queens, and which is, by the way, surrounded by other apartment buildings, but its particular site isn't zoned for an apartment building. And the documentation that was submitted to the Department of City Planning totaled 995 pages. Now, by any standard, that is not a short form, and that is a very expensive impediment to a private applicant or even a public applicant intending to build an apartment building. And so For example, raising the threshold, I think, is very important. And I think that we really need to think about whether any great environmental harm would be done. Let's say if the threshold were raised to 200 units for cities over 1 million population, which would only cover New York City, which the state legislature could do. And that would save the city a great deal of money when it does zoning changes for its own publicly assisted housing, and it would save private applicants a great deal of money as well.
Thank you, Eric. Elena, I was curious on your thoughts on what we need from Seeker.
Well, what we need from Seeker, what we need from the next mayoral, this mayoral. I mean, so what happened in December was, you know, a good cleanup on some technical language, right? And it'll help the lawyers, but like on substance, right? It really doesn't shift dramatically anything. To me, it's a huge question mark what is going to come out from the current technical manual reform process. And you know, I think, you know, unfortunately, I think what we've seen from the de Blasio administration is, you know, a lot of digging in on my policies were right and our approach is still fundamentally right and the system is not broken. So because of those overarching stances, I don't expect anything that will radically shape or shift the manual. And because it's a long process to shift it, I don't know that the next administration will take it on. But even if they did, right, it doesn't make tremendous sense absent, right, looking at the systems and the framework and even the environmental review law, right, and how it all works together. Because I think that one of the fundamental stressors on Seeker as it's implemented is that it is the place where things are getting debated that can be debated because there are no other outlets. And it's not a question of whether that's right or fair. It's a question of what is the system that we want to build. And so what the next administration can do differently is to take on citywide and comprehensive planning in New York City, like wholeheartedly, right? And build on this conversation to do so. The last thing I'll say on that is just that the underlying issues that need to be dealt with, that are the reasons why people are all calling for these fixes, are not going anywhere. So it's not a question of like political expediency or austerity or budgets. This is a question of, are you going to do what is necessary for the future of the city, right? Like our actual survival. Or are you just going to let it continue, you know, in this downward slide that is exacerbating disparities, leaving us completely vulnerable, and not allowing us to live up to the incredible potential that we have?
Thank you so much. Spencer and Bruno, I wanted to give you an opportunity to contribute to this conversation if you have any thoughts.
Sure, yes. You know, I think Seeker, making it more accessible to the public is a really critical challenge. You know, as Eric stated, those documents can be hundreds, if not over 1,000 pages, lots of appendices that also, I think, leave communities in the dark. And so oftentimes communities are coming to a land use review process when it's in ULURP, when it's at their community board, when it's going to council or city planning commission. And they don't realize that that environmental quality review process is the time to ask questions about, are you considering other alternatives? What about these impacts to these target populations or with these community services? And so the next administration can do a lot to, I think, bring people into the environmental review process that goes beyond sort of, did we have a scoping hearing? Was there a comment period? To really daylight that information so that communities are in conversation with development projects earlier in the process. And I think part of the flaw of Seeker. Certainly we can be asking better questions and maybe more targeted questions to sort of streamline that process so that we're getting to a more efficient outcome and results. But ultimately, we need to make sure that the community engagement portion of that, that the data and the technical aspects of it aren't a barrier for people to really ask important questions and answer important questions, so that then those things can improve and inform the decision-making process.
Thank you so much. Bruno, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this.
No, actually not too much more than what's already been added.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I want to move on to our next topic then, talking about racial impacts. So numerous advocates have raised concerns about inequitable racial outcomes in the land use and planning process, and many have called for reforms to address these issues. In particular, communities have raised concerns on numerous occasions about racial displacement and following rezonings in their neighborhoods. Advocates have previously pressed the 2019 Charter Revision Commission to change the rules on environmental impact statements to include racial factors, but the commission ultimately declined to take up that issue. That same year, though, City Council introduced a bill that would mandate a racial impact study for land use actions that require environmental review as a means for addressing inequity and displacement in communities that face major land use actions. And so to start the conversation, perhaps it's useful to talk about, what a racial impact study is and why it's needed, or why many feel that it is needed, and how these impact studies would help guide city decision making. Spencer, perhaps you want to comment on this? Okay.
Sure. And so a racial impact study is fundamentally what it sounds like. It's a disclosure of potential impacts on race that looks at existing conditions and then makes some estimations on what types of impacts might be able to be anticipated as a result of changes in the number of units that are proposed, the type of jobs or employment that's there, and access to community facilities that are there. It is coming out of a place from communities, as you said, concerns with displacement, but to go back to Queens, for every 89 or 90 unit apartment building that's producing a 1,000-page document, we also have the Special Flushing Waterfront District, in which MAS wrote about in our blog, Much Ado About Flushing, in which a project that introduced 3.5 or 3.4 million square feet to downtown Flushing was only required to do that first short form. And therefore, the community was not able to benefit from the more robust analysis that was available in the environmental impact statement. Similarly, I could point to Lenox Terrace in central Harlem, where community activists were really concerned about what changing demographics as a result of 4 new market rate units in that area would mean for their elected politics. They were sort of, as one of the sort of concentrated areas of African-American communities, they're sort of asking a question, will we still be able to elect and have electoral power at city council? That's a really fundamental question that goes beyond land use impacts. And so ultimately what proponents for a racial impact study are looking to do is to bring race into the conversation at the beginning of the conversation. Too often, communities are having to bring up concerns about displacement and targeted impacts late in the uniform land use review procedure, and it's too late, and there's oftentimes dismissed. And so what we want to do by disclosing this information is to make sure that it's a part of the discussion from the beginning, and then it takes the onus off of communities to be able to then let the data reinforce the lived experience. And too often times communities, when they're coming, those stories are dismissed as anecdotal. And unless there's sort of data to back them up to say, no, we really are losing this population, we're losing these businesses, they can be too easily dismissed or manipulated in Seeker. And so really having a new process that is independent, that is bolstering that, is really needed to build trust and to make sure to bring those communities' experience into the conversation at the ground level.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful. On the question of, the community's experience, Bruno, I don't know if you have anything to add to this. I'm curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I have kind of a little bunch on this. I really 100% agree with Spencer's framing of the issue, in that it's really about bringing new information, specifically on race, really early in the process, to introduce that as an important topic and to give communities the ability to talk about this in a formal and data-driven way, and honestly just kind of a way that's easier for decision makers and planners and agencies to talk about it, because it's a subject of conversation that has been held in the community already for a long time. So I think the logic of bringing something into the process that reflects the lived experience is exactly that. I think, at least for us over here at Communities Resist, over here in Williamsburg and Bushwick, we can point to like two really clear examples on our end. One of them is the Broadway Triangle, in which the onus ended up being on the community to bring the potential racial impacts of the Broadway Triangle rezoning, in particular within the context of a community that was being heavily gentrified, suffering a lot of displacement and suffering a lot of racial segregation. It was unfortunate that the city just chose not to really study it. And in lieu then of the community bringing forth this concern and saying, you have to understand how this will affect us on a racial basis, you have to understand how this is going to gentrify the community based on race and like seriously displaced Black and brown people, the city then chose to kind of ignore that. And it was kind of a thing where it was just public commentary, like especially back then, almost 15 years ago, community wasn't really versed in how to engage with the planning process. So we didn't know when to bring it up. Sometimes we were too late, sometimes we were in appropriate areas. And that was really disempowering. Then unfortunately, when we did bring data and when solutions were brought from a data-driven place that really reinforced and reflected our lived experiences of what we were testifying to, it was further ignored. So a lot of the logic and a lot of the need and impetus for mandating a racial impact study and then to disaggregate these impacts based on race and bring this data really early, and then to kind of force the city agencies, planners, applicants to contend with that information and contend with that experience. A lot of that comes from what we experienced over in the Broadway Triangle. And I know that's not just our community, that's many other communities. Going back to what Elena said earlier, it's about making the invisible visible. Like, these things were real. We were told they weren't. We brought the data forward that proved it was real. It was ignored anyway because there was no legal backing to take it seriously. So the racial impact study is really about fixing all of that, and making them take this data into consideration and making them use it in a very real way.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. So I guess my next question is more so, when should this study take place, right? So is seeker the right process for addressing these concerns? If so, would reforms to seeker be enough? What role potentially could comprehensive planning play in addressing racial disparities? And Elena, I was hoping to bring you into this conversation.
Sure, thanks. So, the question of, is this the right process for addressing concerns? I'm not sure that seeker addresses anything, right? Seeker is supposed to disclose, right? And there are actually, there's not much that requires that anything that is an significant adverse impact actually get mitigated, right? So the political process that builds off of the disclosure is supposed to address something, right? So just kind of want to draw that distinction. At the same time, right, every process is the right process to consider racial inequities and how we can deal with them, right? We have systemic racism that pervades everything, right? So there's no place where we can't at least talk about it, right? And that's literally all this requirement would add is saying, we have to look at it here, right? It doesn't say what you have to conclude, doesn't say what has to happen. It says we need to not hide it. We need to look at it. So absolutely, this is the place. Every place is the place. Would reforming seeker or doing this solve all the problems? Absolutely not, nowhere close. Could they do something? Let's see what they could do, right? That's still the political process, that's still power, that's still politics. And that's hopefully still our sort of like moral consciousness moving forward to a higher plane than we are collectively at. And, you know, what role could comprehensive planning play in addressing racial disparities? A fabulous one, right? And it should, and it must, and it can, right? But it's not an either or, right? A little bit reminds me like the question of like, is this the right place to do it? It's a little bit about, you know, like Upper West Siders saying, you know, this isn't the right place for a homeless shelter, or Mass Bethers saying, this isn't the right place for I completely support the homeless. I absolutely believe in homeless shelters, but I just don't think that this is the place, right? So same thing, every place is the place, right? For addressing homelessness and for addressing racial disparities.
Thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit, I think, about some of the tensions that are in this conversation about displacement specifically. So my question is, how do we reconcile, on the one hand, a desire to maintain the status quo with regard to neighborhood composition with a competing desire to reduce racial segregation in the city? And I sort of related to question to that is, you know, are these concepts necessarily in tension? And Noah, I was hoping to get your thoughts.
Yeah, it's such an important question because this is a tension that I think is real and sort of goes through a lot of fair housing work, right? You know, at the national level, there's sort of a big debate about place-based or mobility-based strategies for fair housing. There's been a lot of litigation over it. You know, HUD has said, you know, in the Obama administration to take a balanced approach and to try and do both, which I think has a lot of wisdom to it. But the tension is real. I mean, just to pick like the most pointed example, you've got a scarce number of subsidies for affordable housing. Do you put them in a rich white neighborhood, or do you put them in a poor Black neighborhood, you know, when there's only so many to go around? And they both are important things to do. But at the end of the day, you have to make trade-offs, which I think goes to the larger point of sort of thinking about how to do this racial impact analysis. I agree with so much of what's been said about why, but the methodology really matters, because if you look at one thing and you don't look at the rest, when you have something like race that is so woven into every single piece of our land use system and our real estate system, you could really make things worse instead of better by blessing something as not having a racial impact when it does, because you're only looking over here and you're not looking over there. And that, I think, would be a grave disservice. So I want to flag two examples. One is the one you talked about, sort of this tension between different racial equity goals, right? Are we talking about integration? Are we talking about anti-displacement? So you want to make sure that any racial impact analysis is able to look at all of these different kinds of racial equity that we're concerned with. And that may require a less quantitative and more holistic approach. So Boston just passed reforms to its zoning code requiring a affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis of certain projects, basically a racial impact analysis. And unlike some of the legislation that's been proposed in New York, they sort of say, describe, you know, qualitatively, and they give a few different categories of kinds of impact. You know, I don't know if that's better. I don't think we have best practices in this area yet, but I want to put it out there, sort of a very different model from the very quantitative, very displacement focused methodology that I think the current council bill puts forward. The other sort of like getting it right piece of it that I think is critical is you have to compare the harms from action to the harms from inaction, because the status quo is not one of racial equity. And 10 years down the line, it may be even worse to have done nothing than to have done something, even if the doing something is very likely to create certain racial impacts. It may mitigate or prevent some larger set of other ones. You know, so especially when we think about, you know, okay, there's going to be racial impacts caused by growth. There's huge racial impacts that we're seeing from an undersupply of housing. How do you balance those? I mean, that's the question. You know, I think different people will come out with different answers, but you can't only look at one side of the equation or you will get the wrong answer. And if you get the wrong answer, you will make the wrong choices. So I would sort of say, like, just to put up a yellow light to say this is so important that if you don't do it right, you could really exacerbate the existing racial inequities by masking some of them, and that would be a big mistake.
Thank you, Noah. Marcel, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, on the tension question, I think as long as high income housing continues to be built in low income neighborhoods, including in some cases affordable housing that is designated for people making much more than the neighborhood average, so it's really not fulfilling the housing needs of the local population, and having little to no additional housing in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods, which among the more affluent areas and trends over the past decade show that there's been a net loss of housing stock. This tension will continue to be true. The opposite dynamic, which I think is a true test of integration, and the opposite of gentrification, still remains relatively rare. Maybe the only exception recently is what's happening in Soho and NoHo. So if we're able to reverse the dynamic, probably I suspect that this tension would start to move away, or at least we substantially reduced from where we are currently today. And I believe that something like a racial impact statement could go a long way in doing more of that and showing when there will be cases that will facilitate or improve integration and reversing that type of dynamic that I was mentioning, and not just focusing on kind of this reaction of anti-displacement concerns. So I think it can serve both purposes.
Thank you so much, Marcel. Just being mindful of time, I wanted to address at least one of our audience questions. We had a couple of really good ones. One question that we had, our audience member says, coming from California, where they have strict planning requirements, I've observed lengthy comprehensive planning processes that have little real-world impact, as actual policies are driven more by changing conditions and politics. How do we make sure comprehensive planning is actually useful? And I think a question that I have to tack on to that is, how do we actually hold policymakers accountable for implementing the plans and following them as they are drafted? I'm going to open this up to all of our panelists.
Okay, well, I'll take that on. I think that the question about accountability is really hard because there's an election every 4 years. You can't hold really. There are only two candidates. You can't hold people accountable. You're voting for the candidate whom, on the whole, you like better. But you really can't hold people accountable for every single thing you don't like about what just happened, in the previous 4 years. The same thing with your council member. Your council member is only one of 51, and it's very hard to hold your council member accountable specifically for the things that have happened, because the council member could say, well, I oppose that, but it got approved anyway. So, the answer is that accountability is very difficult. It's not non-existent. And clearly the sort of political atmosphere shifts. If you look at how the political atmosphere shifted from the Bloomberg administration to the de Blasio administration, we can see that there was clearly pressure to do some things differently. If you look at what happened in the de Blasio administration vis-a-vis the current mayoral primary campaign, it's clear that again, people are reacting to what happened in the de Blasio administration. Everybody is proposing, for example, to do rezonings in high opportunity areas which is something that Bill de Blasio was criticized for not doing, although, late in the day, he's come around to at least proposing a couple of such rezonings, and we'll see if they actually get enacted. So there is, in a very broad sense, response of this, but in a narrow sense, it's very difficult to hold specific politicians accountable for specific events.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. We are over time, unfortunately, and I wish we could continue this conversation, but I have to unfortunately end here. I just want to thank all of our panelists so much for joining us today. It was a very insightful conversation. I really appreciate all of your thoughts on these issues, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us. And we'll see what happens, in the next coming months and years. Will these proposals actually take form? Will they create any meaningful change? So again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you.